Hey friends, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of the most ridiculous and terrifying ideas humans ever turned into law, fighting to the death for the truth. That's right. Welcome to the world of medieval duels, where settling an argument meant grabbing a sword, praying loudly, and hoping you didn't trip in the mud before your opponent caved your ribs in. Now, take a breath, dim the lights, maybe put on some headphones or light background noise, because we're heading back to a time when men proved innocence with a blade, where you could literally die for spilling beer on the wrong noble's boot, and where losing your temper might cost you your life. In a world without paperwork, where ink was expensive and bureaucracy barely existed outside royal courts, there was another way to prove your point. You didn't file a complaint, hire a lawyer, or wait for a judge to send you a scroll with a wax seal. No. You picked up a weapon, stepped into the mud, and hoped the crowd would cheer when it was over. In medieval Europe, truth wasn't a matter of evidence. It was a matter of endurance, of swing speed, of who could land a blow before their opponent slipped in a cow patty and cracked a rib. Picture this. Two men in a village square. One says the other stole his chicken. That's not a joke. That's motive. The accused says he didn't. The crowd begins to gather. A few neighbors nod solemnly. The accusation is serious. Chickens lay eggs. Eggs make bread. Bread makes life. And in a time where the value of a life could be debated, but a chicken had fixed worth, this was no small matter. So what happens next? Do they sit and talk, share ale, and resolve things like adults? Absolutely not. They duel. No jury, no depositions, no appeals, just steel, sweat, and a vague hope that God's sense of justice aligns with your right hook. This wasn't some fringe cultural oddity. This was built into the rhythm of daily life, a structure, however flawed, that made sense in a world where most people couldn't read, but everyone understood a punch to the jaw. What began with small insults often ended in bruises, broken bones, or something much worse. If you spilled someone's drink, you apologized. If they thought your apology lacked sincerity, you fought. If you insulted their mother, you might as well start stretching. The logic was circular and merciless. The one who wins the fight is telling the truth, because why else would he win? Surely a higher power wouldn't let a liar walk away with both arms intact. That was the theory. Reality was less tidy. Trial by combat wasn't some underground phenomenon whispered about in taverns. It was law. If someone called you dishonest, a thief, a fraud, you could challenge them formally, in front of witnesses. If they refused, they were guilty by default. If they accepted, the outcome was final. The victor proved his honesty with every blow. The loser, regardless of how the fight ended, had his reputation stained, sometimes permanently, sometimes literally. It didn't matter if the original offense was absurd. A misplaced glove, a misinterpreted glance, a goat that wandered too far. What mattered was the challenge, the spectacle, and the unshakable belief that a fight could settle truth. And in a sense, it did. Because once someone lost, whether by blade, blunt object, or sheer exhaustion, no one brought the issue up again. Justice was served, or at least silenced. The absurdity was part of the design. People didn't duel only over grand offenses. They fought because someone's dog barked too loudly, because someone laughed too long at the wrong joke, because someone's uncle looked at someone's cousin the wrong way at the harvest feast. And that was enough. It wasn't about fairness. It was about status, pride, and maintaining order, the kind of order that came with bruises and stories told around a fire. Still, there was something else underneath the mud and theatrics, something that made it all strangely functional. In a society without strong courts, without consistent law enforcement, where the local constable was more likely to be a drunk than a judge, this was structure. Crude, violent structure, but structure nonetheless. Every village knew its duelists, the hotheads, the veterans, the ones who could barely lift a stick but yelled the loudest. These people weren't just participants, they were enforcers of a code. The code wasn't written, but it was understood. You defend your name, your family, your property. You don't let things slide. If you do, you lose standing. And losing standing in a medieval community meant fewer trades, fewer allies, fewer people who'd help you harvest your grain before the frost. And so people fought for eggs, for honor, for the last jug of beer. They fought in alleys, in fields, behind the church, anywhere flat enough to stand and swing. And while the weapons varied, from swords to sticks to whatever was lying nearby, the result was always the same. A crowd gathered, shouts rang out, and someone went home limping. Of course, it wasn't just about the fight. It was about the ritual, the build-up, the formal challenge, sometimes made with a slap or a thrown glove. The witnesses who stood by, not to interfere, but to confirm that the rules, whatever they happened to be that day, were followed. The moment when both fighters circled each other, hearts pounding, hands trembling, and the whole village watching. This wasn't justice, it was theater. But in that theater, people believed. They believed in the outcome, not because it was fair, but because it was final. It ended disputes. It cut through noise. It said, "Here, now, one of us will walk away proven right, or at least upright." And here lies the cruel brilliance of it all. These fights were simple, but their consequences were profound. If you won, you didn't just settle the score. You rewrote the narrative. You were right. You were strong. And next time, people would think twice before accusing you of anything. That's why they endured. That's why people accepted the absurdity. Because it worked. Not in the way we understand justice today, but in the way medieval people understood survival. A society held together by proximity, suspicion, and the ever-looming threat of winter needed resolution, even if it came wrapped in bruises. And so, in the dirt of some forgotten crossroads, with the sky low and the crowd loud, two villagers raised their weapons, not for glory, not for fun, but because one of them said, "That was my chicken," and the other replied, "Prove it." Long before steel clashed in village squares and muddy fields echoed with the sound of grunting rivals, the idea that justice could be fought for, quite literally, took root in the tribal customs of early medieval Europe. This was a time when writing was a mystery to most, law was spoken, not read, and justice was less about facts and more about fate. There were no courthouses, no clerks, no juries. There was only the will of the gods and your ability to stay standing after a blow to the ribs. Among the Germanic tribes, especially the Franks, the idea of divine judgment wasn't a metaphor, it was policy. If two parties disputed something, land, honor, livestock, or whether someone was secretly from a rival tribe, They didn't sort it out with witnesses or signatures. They invoked the gods, and the gods, being rather busy and disinterested in human nuance, were expected to show their will through the outcome of a fight. This wasn't just superstition, it was institutional. In fact, some of the earliest written codes of Germanic law, like the Lex Salica, literally spell out the right to challenge someone to a duel if they call you a liar. The logic? God, or the divine powers that be, would never allow an unjust man to win a fight, at least not one fought in the proper ritualistic fashion. So if you won, you were right, and if you lost, well, clearly, your cause lacked divine approval, no further questions. But this wasn't some chaotic free-for-all. Trial by combat was seen as orderly, sacred even. It was a spiritual process as much as a physical one. Before the duel, both combatants swore oaths, invoked the names of saints or tribal deities, and pledged that their cause was just. The duel itself was the ceremony. The result was the judgment. And the judgment, once made, was absolute. In a world where natural disasters were punishments from above, and illness could be seen as a sign of moral failing, it made perfect sense that the outcome of a fight could determine the truth. If you were innocent, the gods would protect you. Your arm would be faster, your footing more sure, your enemy more clumsy. If you were guilty, no amount of practice would save you. Your sword would slip, your breath would falter, your guilt would weigh you down like stones in your boots. This was the essence of what came to be called Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. And it wasn't just a pagan notion. As Christianity spread across Europe, the idea didn't go away. It simply changed uniform. The tribal gods were replaced by the Christian God, and the rituals were adjusted to include prayers, blessings, and the occasional bishop making sure things didn't get too out of hand. But the belief remained. Truth was a thing revealed not through dialogue or discovery, but through ordeal. And among the most dramatic ordeals of all was combat. The duel was just one flavor of divine test. There were others. Trial by fire asked you to carry a red-hot iron in your bare hands and walk 3 paces. If your wounds healed cleanly in a few days, you were innocent. Trial by water asked you to be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty, because purity rejected you. If you sank, well, congratulations, you were innocent, and probably not breathing anymore. But the duel stood out, because it offered the illusion of control. It gave the accused a chance to act, to fight, to swing for their innocence. It was active, theatrical, and deeply satisfying to a public that loved spectacle. It looked like justice, it felt like truth, and it didn't require a priest to interpret bruises, only to bless the blade. Over time, trial by combat embedded itself so deeply into custom that it began to be seen as almost sacred. Monarchs codified it, nobles used it, peasants feared it, and for centuries it remained a go-to method for sorting out everything from property disputes to serious criminal accusations. The higher the stakes, the more likely someone was to reach for a sword rather than a scroll. But here's where things begin to twist, because not everyone who won was righteous, and not everyone who lost was guilty. Sometimes the weak had better reflexes, sometimes the guilty trained harder, and sometimes, often actually, luck played a bigger role than piety. People started to notice. They began to whisper, what if the outcome wasn't divine? What if the gods weren't watching? Or worse, what if they got it wrong? What if a man accused falsely, prayed sincerely, fought bravely, and still lost? What then? In those moments, when the crowd went quiet and the guilty lay groaning in the dirt, something in the foundation of divine justice cracked. But it didn't collapse, not yet. People explained it away. Maybe the accused had hidden sin. Maybe he lacked true faith. Maybe God had a long-term plan no one could see. The system remained intact, but the seeds of doubt were planted, seeds that centuries later would bloom into law codes, into rational trials, into the notion that perhaps, just perhaps, truth should be determined by more than bruises and broken ribs. Still, in the world we're talking about, those ideas hadn't taken hold yet. Back then, the sword was still a scale, the arena was a courtroom, and God, silent as ever, was assumed to be watching. Forget the windswept cliffs of heroic paintings or the gleaming tournament fields of romantic ballads. The first arenas of medieval duels were something far less poetic, more muck than marble, more shouting than ceremony. Picture a patch of trampled earth behind the tavern, a town square littered with straw and old turnip peels, or a weedy clearing just wide enough to swing a stick without hitting the local priest. This was where truth came to bleed, and no one was wearing armor polished for a portrait. The duel wasn't always grand. In fact, most of the time, it was anything but. It was desperate, uncoordinated, loud, a clunky, sweat-soaked collision of human frustration and improvised justice. These early fights, far removed from chivalric ideals, were gritty spectacles that felt more like bar brawls with spiritual permission. Yet they carried the full weight of the law, or what passed for law, when scrolls were rare and tempers permanent. There were no referees in elegant robes. Sometimes there wasn't even an audience, unless you counted the chickens pecking nearby. The idea was simple. Two people had a problem, and they would solve it by hitting each other until the truth fell out, or until someone did. The weapons? Whatever you brought. A sword, if you were lucky. A club, if you were practical. A pitchfork, if things escalated before you finished morning chores. The ground was rarely even. Mud puddles formed traps. Stones and broken cart pieces turned ankles. In winter, the duels turned into frozen slap fests, breath clouding in the air as participants slipped and cursed through layers of ice and wool. In summer, sweat turned dirt into paste, and each step risked a knee-deep plunge into what could only be described as fermented battlefield. The combatants, not knights, not champions, just people. Oh, some were farmers with bad aim, some were butchers with meat hooks, some were already limping from last week's duel. Honor wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was just petty. Someone accused your cousin of cheating at dice. Someone stepped on your boot. Someone insulted your sister's bread, and now you were swinging. Preparation was minimal. Maybe you said a prayer. Maybe you tied your belt tighter. Maybe you hoped the other guy was drunker than you. Formal rules were vague, and enforcement depended entirely on who showed up. Occasionally, a local elder or drunk uncle would stand in as a judge, mostly just to shout "enough" when someone started using teeth. Until that point, anything went, and yet this chaos wasn't dismissed. It wasn't laughed off. It was accepted, even expected. These duels weren't outlaw behavior. They were a form of resolution, a public service in a way. They saved time. They settled scores. They reminded the village that even in a world without stable courts, there was still a way to make things right, even if that meant hitting someone in the face with a stick until they admitted your goat was, in fact, theirs first. Sometimes the outcome was clear. One person tapped out, crawled away, or lay groaning while the crowd nodded. But other times, it dragged on, a slugfest without elegance. Fights could last hours, with combatants taking breaks to catch their breath, spit blood, or shout new insults. In some places, the duel didn't end until one party couldn't stand. In others, it stopped when one person wept. Dignity was optional, finality was not. The gear, when there was any, wasn't uniform. One man might show up in quilted pattens stuffed with straw and old socks, another in a half-rusted mail shirt inherited from a dead uncle. Helmets were rare, shields even rarer. Most relied on agility, instinct, and the hope that God, gravity, or both would favor them. These duels were loud, not with trumpets or fanfare, but with cursing grunts, the dull thud of wood against flesh, and the occasional scream when someone realized bones weren't supposed to bend that way. Spectators, when present, cheered not for sportsmanship, but for drama. It wasn't about grace, it was about grit. The crowd wanted action. A clean strike drew gasps. A slip into a mud puddle got laughter. And if someone got knocked out by a swing meant for the knee, well, that became a story told over ale for months. And yet, through the dirt and disorder, the duel held power. It mattered. It had weight. No matter how chaotic it seemed, it delivered results people believed in. You could walk away knowing the village had seen your side, or at the very least, they'd seen you survive. Which leads to the uncomfortable question: was this justice? Could something this unregulated, this unpredictable, truly serve as a societal tool for truth? The answer to medieval minds was yes, because it wasn't about fairness by our modern standards. It was about resolution, about action, about not letting things fester. A wrong met with silence became suspicion. A wrong met with confrontation became closure. And so, again and again, the duels continued. In backyards, behind barns, in front of the local tavern. No shining armor, no heralds, just two people, a crowd, and the kind of intensity that only comes when your reputation and possibly your front teeth are on the line. It was raw, it was unscripted, and in a way it was deeply human. Strip away the ceremony, the speeches, the courtrooms. What you're left with is two people saying, "I'm right, prove me wrong," and then trying to do exactly that with everything they have. Victory didn't always arrive with a final blow. Sometimes it came with a grunt, a collapse, or the simple act of someone muttering through cracked teeth, "Enough." In the muddy courts of medieval justice, duels didn't need to end in blood for the crowd to nod and call it done. A wheeze, a stagger, a shout for mercy, these could be enough to tilt the scales. But the question was never just who won. It was who decided when winning had happened. Unlike the formal tournaments of knights or the choreographed elegance of fencing centuries later, most medieval duels were closer to arguments with weapons. They could start with fury and end with exhaustion. In the best cases, one man went down, stayed down, and the crowd declared him beaten. But not every fight wrapped up so cleanly. What if one man wanted to surrender and the other wasn't finished? What if someone dropped their weapon, raised their hand, and got punched anyway? In theory, There was a moment in every duel where surrender was possible. A word, a gesture, a visible collapse. It was rarely rehearsed, never standardized, and entirely dependent on who was watching. In some towns, crying uncle, literally, was a common way to yield. In others, flinging down your weapon was the cue. In some, you had to crawl out of the ring, dragging your pride behind you. But none of it meant anything if the other party didn't agree to stop. Because here's the grim truth. A duel wasn't over until someone stopped swinging, and not everyone was quick to forgive. For some, surrender wasn't enough, especially if the fight was personal. If the insult had gone deep, a rumor about a wife, a lost inheritance, a betrayal at last year's harvest, no amount of groaning into the dirt would erase it. In those cases, mercy was optional, and sometimes mercy stayed home. There were moments when the crowd intervened, when fists flew past reason and the gathered villagers, friends, family, onlookers with half-eaten bread, had to step in and pull the fighters apart. Not out of law, but out of instinct, because something in them understood the line between judgment and vengeance. But there were also times when no one stepped forward, when silence wrapped the field and the louder man kept going. And then there were the duels that ended not with surrender or a clear victor, but with confusion. A weapon breaks, someone trips, the fighters roll around until neither can breathe. They lie there blinking up at the gray sky, too tired to stand. And the crowd chooses. A village elder might point at the one still twitching and say, "He wins." That was enough. Judgment passed, argument over, honor somehow restored. Of course, this only worked when both sides accepted the outcome. But what if one didn't? What if the man pinned to the ground insisted he wasn't done? What if he spat out blood and swore revenge? In such cases, resolution dissolved, grudges lived on, and sometimes the same two men ended up circling each other again a week later, a little more broken, a little more desperate, their feud now legend. Formal duels, those sanctioned by lords or overseen by local judges, tried to avoid this chaos. They imposed rules, however flexible. A surrender had to be witnessed. The judge had to approve the outcome. There were protocols, oaths, and sometimes even a ceremonial end, with both fighters raising their weapons in salute, however unsteady. But outside the realm of courts and noble estates, most fights ended in uncertainty. What made it even trickier was the fear of dishonor. Yielding too soon could mark you as a coward. Refusing to yield could make you reckless. Some men chose to take a beating rather than give in early. Others shouted their defeat with flair, turning loss into performance, drawing laughs instead of shame. One man famously threw down his club, sat cross-legged in the mud, and declared, "I yield to your stink." The crowd roared. He lost the duel, but won the tavern's laughter for months. And yet, underneath all the bravado, there was vulnerability. Every duel was a gamble. The moment of surrender was the tightrope walk between survival and humiliation. You had to know your opponent. Was he the type to accept your surrender, or the type to make sure you wouldn't get up again? Trust was a strange companion in a duel. You hoped for it, counted on it, but never expected it. Because in the world of medieval justice, surrender wasn't a right, it was a risk. Sometimes, the best you could hope for was that your opponent would recognize the sag of your shoulders, the wheeze in your chest, the way your grip faltered on the handle of your weapon, that he'd see in your eyes the unspoken plea, let this be enough. And that, just maybe, he'd nod. But if he didn't, if he stepped forward, teeth bared and arms raised, then all that was left was instinct. No rules, no mercy. Just two people locked in the final brutal moments of a fight that had already gone too far. The idea of a woman stepping into a duel, weapon in hand, eyes locked, pride at stake, didn't sit easily with the medieval worldview. This was a society that wrapped women in layers of silence and modesty, where strength was whispered about in kitchens, not displayed in public squares. Women were expected to endure, not to strike. But expectations shatter easily when someone's honor is on the line. And when they did, medieval Europe witnessed something both scandalous and strangely mesmerizing. Women fighting like men, in courts, in fields, in front of crowds that weren't sure whether to gasp or cheer. And cheer they eventually did. Of course, it wasn't just a woman showing up with a sword that made heads turn. It was the way society twisted itself, trying to balance violence with propriety. The solution? Equalize the playing field, literally. If a woman challenged a man to a duel, or was challenged herself, local custom sometimes dictated that the man be placed in a pit, waist deep, with one arm tied behind his back. The woman stood on the ground above him, armed with a club. He had one too, if they were feeling generous. That was medieval justice's idea of balance. Restrict the man, elevate the woman, and let them swing away. It sounds absurd. It was. But it was also real. These weren't mock fights or theatrical spectacles. These were legal proceedings, recognized by courts, governed by custom, and settled with bruises. The crimes varied. A woman could accuse a man of slander, assault, theft, or breach of marriage contract. And if the courts couldn't sort it out with witnesses and testimony, they turned to combat, not in spite of her gender, but because her voice still lacked full standing in a system designed by men. So she fought, because words weren't enough. Imagine the scene. A town square fills. The pit has been dug. The man steps down, covered in sweat and shame, surrounded by villagers suppressing laughter, one arm tied, the other gripping a wooden club. Above him, a woman rolls up her sleeves. Her face is set. She's not smiling. She didn't come here to perform. She came to be heard, in a world where speech alone never did the trick. And then the first swing lands. The crowd flinches, then leans in. Because here's the twist. Once the shock wore off, once the audience realized this was actually happening, fascination took over. There was something magnetic about watching the social script unravel in real time. Women weren't supposed to fight. And yet here she was, swinging, dodging, shouting, defending herself not with whispers or weeping, but with every ounce of her strength. It was chaos wrapped in dignity, an act of rebellion performed with state approval. In these duels, the man's limited movement was intended to simulate parity, but let's be honest, it didn't always work. Some men learned to lunge with terrifying speed despite the pit. Others ignored the rules altogether. And more than once, a woman had to retreat under a hail of blows from a man who decided losing wasn't an option, pit or not. But many women held their ground. They trained, not formally, but through life. Lifting, working, surviving, they knew their bodies. and they knew that a single, well-placed strike could shift the outcome faster than any priest or parchment. These duels weren't about killing. They were about clarity. One person had something to prove. The other had something to lose. The rest was a blur of dirt, sweat, and instinct. And sometimes, just sometimes, the woman won. When she did, the silence that followed was almost sacred, not because people were in awe of her strength, but because they didn't know what to do next. The script had ended. The expected outcome had dissolved, and all that remained was a crowd watching a woman lower her club, straighten her back, and walk away, victorious not only in the fight, but in the eyes of a society that had underestimated her. What made these duels unforgettable wasn't just the spectacle, it was the way they exposed the contradictions of the time. A world that said women were fragile, yet placed them in arenas. A culture that claimed men held the power, then made them fight from a hole. These duels weren't common, but they were telling. They forced people to confront the limits of their assumptions, and they showed that when pushed too far, a woman would not only raise her voice, she would raise her weapon. Of course, not every woman dueled with a club. Some chose champions to fight in their name. Brothers, cousins, hired blades. That too was justice. But for those who chose to fight themselves, the law offered no second chances. You win, and your claim is proven. You lose, and you're wrong, by divine will, by social decree, by the bruises on your back. In the end, these fights weren't about violence. They were about visibility. They were about making society listen the only way it seemed to understand. And while the pit, the club, the tied arm may seem like medieval theater, they carried real consequences, because for a woman in the Middle Ages, being right wasn't enough. You had to prove it. When knights took to the field, the crowd expected honor, nobility, a clean contest between equals beneath the gaze of the divine. What they often got instead was two over-armored men wheezing inside tin cans, crashing into each other like runaway wagons, while spectators prayed no one slipped on a helmet plume. This was the world of chivalric duels, where the illusion of grace collided headfirst with the reality of plate armor, poor ventilation, and nerves made of pudding. From a distance, it all looked majestic. The polished steel, the painted heraldry, the fluttering banners. Before the duel began, each knight would announce his grievance, an insult, a betrayal, a question of lineage, or even something as tragic as a misplaced glove at court. A noble would nod solemnly, trumpets might sound, the crowd would hush, and then, once the signal was given, 200 pounds of steel and ego would charge into each other with the elegance of clashing beer barrels. Up close, it wasn't pretty. The code of chivalry promised that these duels would be dignified, that knights would fight with fairness, courage, and restraint. But that ideal rarely survived contact with adrenaline. Once helmets went on and vision narrowed to a blurry slit, all talk of gallantry vanished. What followed looked less like a ballet of blades and more like a slap fight in a thunderstorm, loud, clumsy, and occasionally tragic. Swords clanged off shields, maces glanced off chest plates, spears snapped. Occasionally, someone dropped their weapon altogether and resorted to wrestling, grappling through layers of steel like toddlers in winter coats. The noise was tremendous, the ringing of blows, the ragged breathing through iron grills, the muffled curses, and the surprised yelps when someone accidentally sat on a gauntlet. Knights didn't duel because it was practical. They dueled because it was expected. A way to prove courage, defend honor, and resolve disputes too delicate for politics. Accusations of treason, dishonor, adultery, these were matters that required spectacle, and nothing screamed spectacle like two noblemen knocking each other sideways in front of royalty and God. The rituals were strict, at least in theory. Both parties so had to agree on the terms. Judges oversaw the proceedings, nobles, clergy, sometimes even the king himself. The weapons were usually matched: longswords, axes, or lances. The armor customized for dueling, thicker plating around vital areas, maybe a spike or two thrown in for flair. Visibilities and movement were sacrificed for protection. Watching two knights duel was like watching a pair of iron cupboards argue about who started the fire. Still, not everything went according to plan. Sometimes the rules were ignored mid-fight. A knight might switch weapons out of panic or clumsiness, or he might drop his sword and try to tackle his opponent to the ground. The line between legal maneuver and desperate flailing was thin. Occasionally, both duelists would end up flat in the mud, unable to stand, reduced to shouting insults through their visors while squires looked away in embarrassment. And when it ended, if it ended, it rarely looked like the stories. There were no dramatic finishing blows, no last-minute flourishes. Most duels concluded when one knight simply couldn't continue. He'd collapse from exhaustion, pinned beneath his opponent, or crushed by the weight of his own armor. He might shout a muffled, "I yield," through a helmet full of regret. If he was lucky, someone heard him. If not, he had to find another way to signal that his will had surrendered before his bones did. Sometimes, the winner didn't even strike the final blow. He just stood up longer, or hit slightly harder, or breathed slightly better. That was enough. The crowd would erupt, the judges would nod, and the loser, assuming he could still move, would be helped off the field by squires who would later recount every stumble in painful detail over dinner. Despite all the clanking chaos, these duels weren't just for show. They carried real legal and social consequences. Winning meant proving your case, defending your name, securing your land or title. Losing could mean disgrace, or worse, and that was if you survived, because no matter how ceremonial the setup, the weapons were real. The bruises lasted, and the edge of a longsword didn't care how noble your intentions were. But what happened beyond the ring? That's where things get murkier. While the code of chivalry painted duels as noble rituals, the truth often leaked out around the edges. Duels were used to intimidate rivals, settle vendettas, or display dominance. Some knights picked fights not out of honor, but ambition. Others accepted challenges they knew they'd lose, hoping to gain sympathy or fame in failure. And sometimes, more often than anyone liked to admit, the fight wasn't about truth at all. It was about theater, a performance for lords and ladies, a way to distract from politics, to entertain the bored, or to send a message to the court. "See what I'm willing to do for my name," the knight's bruised body seemed to say. "See how far I'll go to prove I'm right." And so, the crowd watched, not for truth, not even for justice, but for the clang of metal, the weight of tradition, and the strange satisfaction of seeing two men in armor desperately try to remember why they agreed to this in the first place. For a system supposedly built on divine justice, trial by combat didn't always look like heaven's work. Especially when the victor stumbled away drunk, bleeding or cackling like he'd just wrestled a goat for sport. Yet the church, guardian of souls, shepherd of morality, mouthpiece of God himself, rarely stepped in to stop it. On the contrary, for centuries, it stood just close enough to bless the process without ever getting splattered by the mud. This uneasy alliance between faith and fists didn't emerge by accident. From the very beginning, trial by combat was marketed as Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. And that gave it, paradoxically, both legitimacy and distance. It wasn't the church's violence. It was divine will manifesting through earthly struggle. The arena wasn't just a pit of sweat and steel. It was a holy stage. But let's rewind. The early medieval church, especially in the chaos after Rome's fall, didn't yet wield the centralized power it later would. It existed as one authority among many, sometimes spiritual, sometimes judicial, always aware of the need to survive. And in the world it lived in, people didn't want complex legal codes or theological lectures on sin. They wanted resolution, clear, immediate, and ideally loud enough for the neighbors to hear. So when Germanic and Frankish tribes brought with them the notion that God could reveal truth through physical victory, the church didn't push back. Instead, it baptized the idea, quite literally. Duels were prefaced with prayers, often held near churches or on land sanctified for such purposes. Clergy would bless the weapons, offer mass beforehand, and sometimes even serve as official witnesses. It was messy theology, but it fit the times. Still, not every clergyman was thrilled. As the church grew more organized, more literate, more Roman in style, some voices began to squirm. Was it really godly to let two angry men settle land disputes with axes? Could divine will truly be revealed by whoever happened to be better fed, younger, or sneakier? What if the man who won the duel was a known drunk, or a chronic liar, or had bribed the local judge to pick favorable ground? Would God really back that? And yet, trial by combat endured, not despite the church's concerns, but sometimes because of them. You see, the church had something to gain. In a world drowning in feuds, grudges, and private vengeance, trial by combat offered structure. It was a pressure valve. If two nobles could settle their hatred with a duel, rather than burning villages or murdering each other's nephews, then peace, in a twisted way, was preserved. Fewer vendettas meant fewer funerals, and fewer funerals meant fewer angry widows knocking on monastery doors, asking why God had done nothing. It also offered authority. The church wasn't the one swinging the sword, but it was the one sanctifying the stage. That mattered. By placing itself just adjacent to the ritual, never fully endorsing it, but never fully condemning it, the church maintained influence over the outcome without risking its hands. If the duel went well, it was proof of divine judgment. If it went poorly, well, perhaps the participants hadn't prayed hard enough. Some bishops even collected fees for overseeing the process. After all, dueling required clerical presence. Someone had to record the oaths, bless the participants, and officiate the spiritual side of the event. These weren't services provided for free. In this way, trial by combat became yet another moment where faith intersected with finance, a holy fight with a price tag. But there were cracks in the system. By the 9th and 10th centuries, some reformist voices within the church began to grow louder. The idea that violence could uncover moral truth seemed increasingly incompatible with Christian teaching. Councils were held, decrees were issued. Trial by combat was questioned, banned, revived, softened, reshaped. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council officially condemned the practice, or at least strongly discouraged it, marking one of the first decisive moves to separate justice from bloodshed. Yet even then, the duel did not vanish. Why? Because the church's stance, while clear on paper, often meant little on the ground. Secular courts, especially among nobles, continued to allow trial by combat, long after clerics wrung their hands over it. The gap between law and practice remained wide, and the people, the villagers, the knights, the landowners with bruised egos, still believed, not necessarily in theology, but in the fight, in its simplicity, its finality, its ability to make things right when nothing else could. And if the church disapproved, it rarely fought too hard, because deep down, many in the hierarchy knew that controlling the duel was better than abolishing it. A world without trial by combat might seem holier, but it also risked being messier. More feuds, more revenge, less order. So they chose, in many cases, to look away, or better yet, to manage the mess. Of course, not every priest approved. Some tried to intervene. There are records of clergy interrupting duels, refusing to bless weapons, even excommunicating participants. But those were exceptions, not the rule. Most understood that the fight wasn't just a ritual, it was a system. And systems, especially ones backed by swords, don't change easily. So the church walked a careful line. It preached peace while blessing battle. It condemned vengeance while charging a fee to witness it. It claimed God revealed truth in Scripture, but still stood by as two men tried to find it with blunt force. And maybe in the end, that was the church's greatest gamble. Not that God would always side with the righteous, but that the people wouldn't notice when he didn't. Among the thatched roofs and uneven fences of medieval villages, far from the castles and cathedrals, the duel wore no armor. It didn't come with horns or silk banners. It showed up suddenly, in the mud, outside a granary beside a well, and it looked more like an argument with kitchen tools than a contest of chivalry. For peasants, dueling was raw necessity, a way to assert dignity in a world where the law didn't speak their language, and lords didn't care if someone took your chicken, your bucket, or your only block of cheese. When words failed, and they often did, you reached for whatever your hands could find, not because you wanted to fight, but because there was no other way to be heard. There was no judge, no priest, no ceremonial pit for the poor. If two peasants had a quarrel, they settled it in the open, on market day, at the mill, in the barn. Someone accused someone else of stealing eggs. Someone claimed his boundary stone had been moved 3 steps to the left. Someone said the cheese wasn't goat. And in a culture where honor mattered more than logic, these weren't petty complaints. They were declarations of war, or at least of a scuffle in the mud. The weapons were never standardized and rarely elegant. A shovel, a ladle, a wooden spoon. If you were lucky, you grabbed a staff. If not, a brick would do. Some fights involved old hoes. Some involved sacks of grain swung like clubs. In one recorded case, a man fought with a leg of salted pork. He lost, but not without making a statement. This was the peasants' duel, spontaneous, unsanctioned, and deeply personal, But don't mistake it for comedy. These fights weren't jokes. They were often desperate, angry, and carried real consequences. A peasant couldn't afford to lose face. His standing in the village, his trades, his friendships, even his access to shared resources like the oven or the well, depended on his perceived strength. If he backed down too quickly, others might take advantage. If he won, his position improved. In this ecosystem of survival, strength equaled safety. Yet the question lingered, did peasants really have a chance? Not always. Not in the formal courts. The duel was a noble's tool, legally sanctioned, publicly judged. For peasants, it was more often informal, tolerated rather than approved. The local lord might ignore it unless someone lost teeth or consciousness. But within the village itself, the duel had currency. People remembered who stood firm, who backed away, who swung with confidence, and who ducked too soon. There was no chivalry here, but there was a code, simple, unspoken. Don't strike someone from behind. Don't use fire. Don't fight someone who can't stand. Beyond that, anything went. And the crowd, when there was one, acted as both jury and entertainment. Bets were made. Ale was spilled. Children watched from fences. The duel, even at the lowest rungs of society, was performance. But that performance revealed something deeper, a truth about identity. Because in a world without uniforms or written records, you were what you carried. A long sword told everyone you'd been trained or had friends in high places. A hunting spear suggested experience. A sharpened stick might mean you were desperate. And a frying pan? Well, that spoke volumes. It meant you grabbed what was closest. It meant you acted without hesitation. It meant you were hungry, angry, and probably not planning to play fair. The weapon became your biography. You didn't just pick it, it picked you. A smith used a hammer, a shepherd a crook, a weaver maybe a spindle. These choices weren't symbolic, they were practical. But over time, they told stories. The village remembered that old Olaf fought with a rake and won. That Marta cracked a man's ribs with a ladle and didn't blink. These weren't just fights, they were origin myths. And then there were the improvisers. Those who turned the mundane into the menacing. The man who tied a stone to a rope and spun it like a morning star. The woman who used a broom handle sharpened at both ends. And yes, the ones who brought chains. The flail, in all its chaotic elegance, wasn't born in an armory. It was born in a barn. A stick, a hinge, a chain. Suddenly you had something unpredictable, something terrifying. The weapon didn't swing straight. It snapped. It danced. It hit from angles no one expected. A peasant with a flail could take down a man twice his size, if he didn't knock himself over first. Who came up with it? Likely no one knows. It wasn't a knight. It wasn't a general. It was probably a farmhand with too much hay and too much time. Someone trying to thresh grain faster, only to realize that the tool in his hands could just as easily thrash people. The flail, and other improvised weapons like it, became the great equalizer. When you couldn't afford steel, you made steel irrelevant. When you lacked technique, you replaced it with chaos. These tools blurred the line between violence and innovation, and they reminded everyone watching that danger didn't come from wealth or training. It came from creativity and the willingness to swing hard when your pride was on the line. So the next time someone grabbed a stick or a pan, it wasn't just desperation, it was declaration. I may be poor, I may be barefoot, but I have something to say, and this, in my hand, is how I'll say it. Yes, it really happened. In the twisted theater of medieval justice, where men fought for cheese, women swung clubs from the edge of pits, and frying pans became symbols of honor, even animals sometimes took the stage, and not as bystanders, as defendants, as challengers, as warriors in the most bizarre corners of human imagination and legal systems that somehow allowed it. There were cases where pigs stood trial for destroying crops, where roosters were condemned for crowing at the wrong hour. But one story, absurd, unforgettable, and absolutely real, tells of a dog that not only stood accused, but fought a knight in a duel and won. The year was 1400 something. The place, France, a country that had already perfected the art of treating duels as divine arbitration. The story goes like this. A nobleman named Aubry de Montdidier was found dead in the woods. No witnesses, no suspects. But his dog, a loyal greyhound, wouldn't let it go. Every time the knight's friend, a man named Richard de Macaire, appeared, the dog growled, then barked, then lunged, always at him, always only him. It happened again and again, in public, in private, in front of enough people that it couldn't be dismissed. Eventually, suspicion turned into accusation. The dog was trying to tell them something, they said. And in an age where divine will was believed to speak through sword swings and the healing of burns, why not through a dog's rage? So a formal complaint was made. The dog would act as the accuser. The court astonishingly agreed, and they ordered a duel, yes, a duel, between a knight and a dog. It wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't allegory. It was set up as a proper trial by combat. The dog was given legal standing. The knight was stripped of status for the occasion. The fight was arranged in a public arena with spectators, officials, and all the solemn absurdity of a real court proceeding. Aubry's greyhound was brought in, muzzled until the moment of truth. Richard de Macaire stood armed, tense, trying not to look ridiculous. The duel began. The dog launched, fast, furious, precise. It bit, it dodged, it clawed at the knight's legs with a kind of divine fury only a wronged animal could possess. The knight swung wildly, missed, stumbled, panicked. The greyhound latched onto his throat and dragged him to the ground. And as the stunned crowd watched, Macaire, bleeding, humiliated, terrified, confessed. Right there, in the dirt, with a dog standing over him, growling. He confessed to the murder of Aubry de Montdidier. The court accepted the confession. The knight was sentenced. The dog became a hero. To the villagers, this wasn't just justice. It was proof that divine judgment really did work, even through paws and teeth. The greyhound was paraded, honored, and immortalized in ballads and tales. Monks wrote about it. Chroniclers preserved it. Over time, the story gained mythical status, retold again and again with slight variations. But the core never changed. A dog uncovered a murderer, and the law, against all logic, let the dog fight for justice. Was this an isolated case? Sort of. But it wasn't entirely out of step with the times. Animals were routinely tried for crimes in medieval Europe. A pig could be hanged for biting a child. A horse could be exiled for kicking someone to their end. Rats were summoned to court and given time to appear. These weren't jokes. They were official court proceedings, often attended by serious people who truly believed justice extended to every living being, and that God's will, when invoked, applied to all creatures, great and small. Why did they do it? Partly it was about order. The medieval mind craved systems, even bizarre ones. If something caused harm, it had to be addressed. If a pig ran wild, it must be punished. If a rooster crowed at the wrong time and disturbed the balance of things, it needed judgment. And if a dog pointed its fury at a man who turned out to be a killer, well, maybe the dog knew something they didn't. Maybe justice, in its strangest form, had barked. In a world obsessed with omens, signs, and divine intervention, the line between animal instinct and divine message blurred. People listened. And when the dog bit and didn't let go, they listened even more. So yes, it really happened. A dog fought a man, won, uncovered a crime, and walked away not just wagging its tail, but carrying the weight of an entire village's belief in something bigger than swords, scrolls, or sermons. Because sometimes justice didn't wear armor, it wore fur. In a society where law often rode on horseback and justice wore chainmail, the duel became more than a way to settle disputes. It became a weapon. But not just a weapon in the literal sense. A duel was a loophole, a ritualized loophole that allowed men, especially powerful ones, to turn vengeance into virtue and murder into morality. You didn't need to sneak through castle halls or poison a goblet. If you wanted someone gone, you issued a challenge. You let the sword do the speaking and the law do the forgiving. Because here's the thing. In many parts of medieval Europe, killing someone in a duel wasn't murder. It was judgment. If you followed the customs, swore your oaths, and the fight was accepted by the court or the community, then whatever happened inside that circle of combat was by definition divine will. You couldn't be punished for winning. You were right, even if you were ruthless, even if you bent the rules, even if everyone watching knew you weren't the better man. You won, and therefore you were innocent. So what better way to eliminate a rival? The logic was clean. No need for assassins. No risk of witnesses turning on you. You just needed a pretext, a vague insult, a misinterpreted gesture, a supposed theft, or a claim of dishonor so slight it could have been imagined. Then came the challenge, and if the other man refused, well, that was public cowardice, a stain on his name. If he accepted, and you had the skill, or the backing of a few conveniently biased judges, then all that was left was to draw blood and watch the law absolve you. It didn't always work, of course. Sometimes the wrong man won. Sometimes the fight spun out of control, exposing motives that had been too neatly hidden. And sometimes the crowd, the eternal witness to all these rituals, refused to believe in divine justice. They saw the trap for what it was, which brings us to one of the most infamous duels in history. A duel so public, so bloody, so entangled with royal politics and personal vengeance that it shook the legal system itself. The year was 1386, France, a country already drowning in war and suspicion. Two men, Jean de Carouge, a knight, proud, impulsive, and stubborn. Jacques Legris, a court favorite, charming, educated, and well-connected. The accusation: Legris had assaulted Carriage's wife, Marguerite. She testified. Carriages, humiliated and enraged, demanded justice. But the court, riddled with Legris's allies, delayed, doubted, hesitated. So Carriages asked for the old way, the final way, trial by combat. King Charles VI approved it. The Parliament of Paris sanctioned it. The people gathered, thousands of them, to watch one of the last legally recognized duels of its kind in French history. This wasn't just about two men, it was about the system, about whether a woman's voice could carry weight, about whether a knight could force the hand of the court, about whether God would side with the powerful or the righteous, and about what the crown would do when the blade had spoken. The duel was brutal. They fought with lances first, then swords, then daggers. Steel tore through flesh, blood soaked into frozen ground, and in the end, Jean de Carouge stood victorious, having driven a dagger through Legrise's throat, right there in front of the king, the court, and an entire nation holding its breath. Legris died proclaiming his innocence, but it didn't matter. The fight was won. That meant truth had been revealed. Marguerite was vindicated. Carriages became a hero. And France, for a brief, flickering moment, believed again in the myth of divine justice. But something else happened too. Doubt. Because this duel was different. It had involved real testimony, real stakes, real people whose lives would be destroyed or preserved depending on a single blade's direction. And the idea that Legris, who had so many defenders, so many claiming he'd been framed, might have been innocent. It haunted people, whispered questions into the ears of lawmakers and monarchs. What if God hadn't spoken clearly? What if justice could no longer hide behind spectacle? And slowly, the tide began to turn. Not instantly, not everywhere. But in the decades that followed, more and more courts began to favor evidence over ordeal, reason over ritual. The age of trial by combat began to fade, not because people stopped believing in it, but because one duel had made them wonder what happened when the blade struck the wrong man. So in the end, dueling lost its legal shield. It didn't disappear. It simply went underground. It evolved into secret challenges behind taverns, into deadly games among nobles, into a new way to kill with honor and walk away clean, at least in the eyes of your peers. But the law had changed. The world had changed, all because one duel went too far and everyone saw it. Because sometimes, even in the most blood-soaked arenas, truth isn't what survives the fight. It's what remains when the swords go silent, and no one's sure what justice even looks like anymore. In an age where honor was currency and reputation could crumble with a whisper, words were weapons, sharper than daggers, more dangerous than arrows. A single insult, thrown casually across a banquet table or scribbled hastily in a letter, could spiral into bloodshed. And not just among kings or knights, but merchants, poets, scholars, anyone with pride to defend and a hand steady enough to grip a blade. The duel was born not only from physical confrontation, but from that silent, invisible sting of being publicly diminished. Honor, after all, wasn't just about what you did. It was about what people said you did. And when someone said the wrong thing, loud enough, or in front of the wrong ears, there was only one path left to restore your name. You challenged them, not in court, not with reason, but with steel. The ritual of offense had its own choreography. It rarely started with yelling. No, it began with a phrase, quiet, measured, designed to slide under the skin. You fight like a man who's never seen war. I hear your wine tastes better than your judgment. Strange how your name appears in every tale of cowardice. They weren't always obvious. That was the art. The best insults were cloaked in civility, a raised eyebrow, a polite smirk, a subtle pause that let everyone else in the room realize what had just happened. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the silence that followed, that electric moment when the air shifted and both men knew something irreversible had been said. Then came the letters. Duels often began not with a sword, but with ink. Long, elegant letters filled with venom and courtesy. A man would accuse another of dishonesty, cowardice, vanity, always couched in formal tones. The recipient would respond in kind, denying everything while adding a counter insult or two. These letters were sometimes read aloud to mutual acquaintances, just to ensure the shame was fully public. And when the letters stopped, the weapons came out. Some of these duels had weight, accusations of betrayal, questions of legitimacy, suspicions of adultery. But others spiraled out of the silliest, most ridiculous corners of ego. One French noble challenged another to a duel because his dog barked at him during a visit. Another fight broke out when a man accused his rival of watering down wine at a feast and implying he couldn't taste the difference. There's even a record of a duel sparked when one man told another his mustache resembled a broom. The insult wasn't just about hair, it was about manhood, cleanliness, self-respect, and that was enough. In Spain, two caballeros once fought because one accused the other of wearing Italian shoes in a time when local fashion dictated otherwise. In Poland, a nobleman challenged another to a duel after being mocked for arriving on a mule instead of a horse. He won, though history doesn't say whether he switched to a stallion afterward. But perhaps the most absurd duel of all began with a sneeze. In the court of a minor German prince, a diplomat sneezed loudly during another man's toast. The man took it as a deliberate insult, a sign of mockery, an interruption at the moment of highest honor. He demanded satisfaction, and despite protests, the duel went forward. Neither man was seriously injured, but the sneeze was never forgotten. Why did these things matter so much? Because in a world without social media, without police investigations or public relations campaigns, your identity lived in the mouths of others. If they laughed at you, you were small. If they whispered, you were scandal. The duel was your reset button, your chance to erase a rumor with a single strike. It wasn't always about pain, it was about performance. You didn't need to win, you needed to stand. To show that your pride had a price and that you were willing to pay it. Sometimes the insult wasn't even directed at you. It was about your wife, your brother, your flag, your region's cheese. But it didn't matter. You carried those affiliations like shields. An attack on any of them was an attack on you. And backing down meant watching everything you were, or pretended to be, melt under someone else's words. It was a fragile system built on ego and theater, but it worked until it didn't, because when everyone's pride is armed, peace becomes a negotiation, and words once harmless become loaded pistols. You couldn't just speak freely. You had to calculate, gauge the tone, measure the crowd, and when you crossed the line, or someone claimed you had, the blade was never far behind. And so men practice the art of the insult as much as the art of the sword. Because sometimes the sharpest strike came not from the edge of steel, but from a sentence delivered just loud enough for everyone to hear, and just cruel enough to make fighting the only way out. When two men agreed to a duel, they weren't just resolving a quarrel, they were booking the village's main event. Word spread faster than the blacksmith's hammer. They're fighting, tomorrow, near the well. And just like that, plans changed. Chickens went unplucked. Bread dough was left to rise too long. Someone dug out a faded cloak. Children ran wild with gossip, and the elderly climbed onto barrels for a better view. Because for one glorious afternoon, there would be blood, shouting, and maybe, if the gods were kind, a scandal to retell for decades. Medieval life was slow, repetitive, and hard. Days blurred together under gray skies and calloused hands. A duel shattered that rhythm. It was theater in the dirt. An unscripted drama with real stakes, familiar faces, and the thrilling possibility that someone might get smacked with a shovel. It was entertainment for people who'd never see a stage, never hear a symphony, never know the rush of a story that wasn't passed down from their grandfather's lips. The setup began early. The arena, sometimes a village square, sometimes a muddy field, became sacred ground, not because it was holy, but because it promised spectacle. Merchants moved their stalls closer. The baker brought extra loaves. The winemaker uncorked jugs with giddy anticipation. People brought stools, flasks, and whatever gossip they could sling. It was equal parts trial and festival, and once the duel began, the crowd became its heartbeat. They cheered, they jeered, they picked sides, even when they didn't know the quarrel. That's Olaf's cousin. He once stole apples from me. I hope he gets kicked. Bias wasn't just expected, it was celebrated. Loyalty danced with pettiness, and for a moment, the community found strange unity in watching two men try to bruise each other into justice. But here's the catch. Duels weren't always exciting. Sometimes they were slow, awkward, comically underwhelming. A blacksmith swung wildly, missed, tripped on a root, and got stuck in his own apron. A shepherd spent more time circling than striking. Two men circled each other for half an hour without so much as a scratch. The tension turned to muttering, then laughter, then boredom. One duel was so long and uneventful that someone started playing a lute in the background, and the music was more memorable than the fight. And when the duel was boring, the audience didn't hide its disappointment. They groaned, they mocked, they threw bits of crust, because they hadn't shown up for a negotiation. They wanted drama. They wanted a fall, a gasp, a crimson splash. If someone didn't bleed, at least someone had to break a tooth. This public pressure wasn't lost on the fighters. Some leaned into it. They hammed it up. They gestured dramatically, taunted their opponent, even threw fake feints just to get the crowd roaring. There were fighters who, knowing they couldn't win, focused instead on entertaining. One man fought an entire duel in complete silence, staring intensely the whole time. Another narrated his own moves like a bard, shouting, "Now I strike. Ah, you parry. But can you block this?" They lost, gloriously, and gained legends in the process. But others, humiliated by the yawns, grew desperate. Boring fights sometimes turned brutal in a heartbeat, as one duelist tried to win back the crowd with raw violence. A slow exchange of blows could erupt into a flurry of rage. And suddenly, what had been a lukewarm scuffle became a frenzy that left one man in the dirt and the crowd gasping. Because even a dull duel could end with something unforgettable. The crowd didn't just want to see a winner. They wanted a story, something to carry home and recount between sips of ale. Did you see how she threw that punch? He cried. I swear he did. They say his tooth landed in the soup kettle. These tales outlived the fighters themselves. They passed into local legend, embroidered with every retelling, until a shove became a backflip and a slap became a sword clash heard across the hills. And just like that, the duel wasn't just a fight. It was folklore in real time. This hunger for drama kept the tradition alive long after its legal purpose faded, even when the courts began to frown on dueling, even when priests muttered about sin and pride. Villages still gathered because people don't abandon stories, especially when they come with snacks. So yes, sometimes the duel disappointed, but most times, whether through comedy, carnage, or sheer absurdity, it gave the people what they craved, a moment of escape, of emotion, of shared attention. A break in the endless wheel of work and want. A living, sweating, gasping reminder that even the lowest villager could become, if only for a moment, the hero, or fool, in the center of a roaring crowd. Once your boots touched the arena dirt, there was no going back. The crowd was watching. The other fighter was watching. And worst of all, you were watching yourself. Every movement suddenly mattered. Every breath felt loud. You could hear the whistle of the wind across your ears and the creak of your joints in armor that didn't quite fit. This wasn't just a test of strength. It was survival, mental, physical, reputational. And if you didn't want to leave the field as a joke or a ghost, you needed more than just a strong arm. You needed a plan, because medieval duels, whether between knights in polished steel or peasants in patched tunics, didn't reward the strongest man. They rewarded the smartest one, the calmest one, the one who understood that fighting isn't always about fury. It's about reading your opponent, the terrain, the silence before the first blow, and especially your own fear. That's why some duelists screamed, not out of rage, but strategy. Before the first clash, fighters often shouted strange, guttural, sometimes downright absurd phrases, a psychological gambit to rattle the enemy or to rouse their own courage. Some bellowed curses, others roared war cries inherited from distant battles. One famous fighter was said to scream, repa, the old Slavic word for turnip, just as he charged. No one knew why, but it worked. His opponents froze, confused or amused, and by the time they regained focus, he'd already closed the distance with terrifying momentum. There were no manuals for this, no official strategies passed down from father to son. But over time, fighters learned what worked. Don't lunge first. Make them guess. Use the sun if it's behind you. Mud is your ally if you can force them into it. Breathe through your nose. Keep your blade up. But above all, don't panic. A panicked man is already halfway defeated. Armor helped, or hurt. It made you feel safe, but dulled your speed. Heavy helmets narrowed your vision. Steel gauntlets weakened your grip. And beneath it all, sweat trickled down your back like a silent clock. Every second wore you down. Every missed strike cost precious energy. Some duelists won by stalling, letting the other exhaust themselves, then stepping in with one clean, brutal finish. But technique wasn't everything. Nerves mattered more. Some men walked onto the field, already broken. They flinched, overthought, looked to the crowd for approval, and saw doubt in every face. Others, usually the unexpected ones, found something deeper, a stillness, a clarity. They didn't swing wildly. They didn't rush. They waited like hunters, and when they moved, it was swift, precise, final. Still, even the best laid plans could fail. Sometimes your opponent was simply better, or luck chose a side, a misstep, a slip, a noise behind you. And suddenly you were on your back, ribs aching, your sword 5 feet away, your breath knocked out like a kicked bellows. In that moment, everything slowed, and you faced the most important decision of the fight, not whether to keep swinging, but how to fall. Because even in defeat, you could win the story. Some men crawled away, others tried to bargain, but the ones who stood, bleeding, breathless, barely conscious, and bowed, those became legends. The ones who, after taking a dozen strikes, still managed a crooked smile, who spat blood and said, "Good hit," who shook the hand of the man who beat them, or laughed at their own mistakes. Villagers remembered those men. Children imitated them. Songs were written not about the winners, but about the losers who refused to be humiliated. That was the secret most people missed. A duel wasn't just a fight. It was a performance. A test of endurance, yes, but also of presence. Could you command the moment? Could you fall with dignity? Could you bleed without begging? Some of the most beloved fighters in history lost nearly every match they fought, but did so with such charisma, such raw defiance, that their names endured longer than the victors. Of course, others didn't get that choice. One wrong hit, one unlucky fall, and the duel ended not in drama, but in silence. But those who did survive, even in failure, could shape how they were remembered. Not every hero needed to win. Some just needed to show up, shout "Rapa" at the sky, and fight like the whole village was watching, because they were. So if you were going to duel, you didn't just train your muscles, you trained your mind. You prepared to lose, and you prepared to lose well, because in the end, the fight would end, the bruises would fade. But the story, the one the butcher told over meat, the one the blacksmith sang while sharpening tools, the one your children whispered to theirs, that would live forever. In the smoky chambers of power, where alliances shifted like sand, and every smile might hide a dagger, there was one tool more subtle than assassination and more final than exile: the duel. Cloaked in the language of honor, it offered rulers a clean solution to a dirty problem. You didn't need to stage a public hanging. You didn't need to send thugs in the night. You simply allowed 2 men to fight and made sure one of them didn't walk away. It was politics, dressed as ritual, a killing with paperwork. The beauty of it was deniability. When a nobleman grew too ambitious, too loud, too popular, the sovereign didn't need to raise a sword. He simply needed to wait. Sooner or later, that man would insult the wrong person or be accused of it. A challenge would be issued, and the court, ever obsessed with the decorum of honor, would nod solemnly and approve. Let them settle it like gentlemen. And when the body hit the ground, the crown stayed clean. It wasn't just convenience. It was strategy, and the first rulers to grasp this weren't necessarily kings. They were powerful men who existed just outside the throne. Chancellors, dukes, regents, men who couldn't afford outright war, but who needed rivals silenced. They saw in duels the perfect trap. It didn't matter who started the fight. What mattered was who finished it. And if you could guide the outcome with influence, bribes, choice of terrain, or even a conveniently slow medic, then the duel became not judgment, but execution by permission. Take Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, cunning, impatient, and always surrounded by enemies he couldn't publicly crush. It's said he once allowed a bitter land dispute to escalate between two barons, knowing full well one of them had just recovered from a broken rib. He approved the duel, arranged the date, and watched silently as the healthier baron ended the fight in a single blow. Problem solved. Territory reallocated. No formal charge, no scandal, just justice. Or consider the court of Henry II of France. When political tensions boiled and noble families began feuding, the king didn't always intervene. He simply gave his blessing when tempers snapped. The Montmorency family, the Guises, more than once they settled disputes through duels that conveniently removed voices the crown found too loud or too proud. And then there's the case of Francois de Vivonne, a favorite at court in the late 1500s. Known for his tongue and temper, he angered more than a few with his ambition. When he found himself suddenly challenged by a lesser noble, someone no one expected to stand a chance, whispers filled the court. The duel was allowed. Officially, it was about an insult over hunting rights. Unofficially, Vivonne had opposed a royal marriage. He died on the fields. The king sent flowers. So who was the first to weaponize the duel as policy? It's hard to name just one. The shift happened quietly, gradually, as powerful men realized the duel wasn't just about honor, it was about control. By allowing, or even encouraging, conflict between rivals, they avoided direct blame while reshaping the map of influence around them. Some historians point to Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century, who let duels thin out rebellious knights without ever lifting his imperial hand. Others cite Edward III of England, whose court was infamous for honor disputes that always seemed to benefit the crown's long-term goals. But the real genius lay not in starting duels, it was in letting them happen. Because a ruler didn't need to order a killing. He only needed to wait for the right insult and then permit the outcome. The theater of justice would play out. The people would cheer or mourn, and the throne would remain untouched. Even the church, which tried repeatedly to restrict the bloodletting, often looked away when noble blood was involved. After all, wasn't it better to let two lords fight each other in a field than drag their armies across the countryside? Wasn't it better for a baron to fall in single combat than for his feud to spill into 100 homes? So the duel, for all its pageantry, became something far darker, a state-approved erasure, a method of maintaining order by letting chaos punch itself out. And if the crown tilted ever so slightly in favor of one fighter by approving his choice of weapon or assigning a sympathetic judge, well, that was just fortune, or providence, or politics done properly, and the message was clear to everyone watching: fight for your honor. But be careful whose honor you challenge, because sometimes the duel wasn't about justice, it was about obedience, and if your blade happened to fail, the ruler wouldn't mourn you. He'd mark your name off his list and move on to the next. As the Middle Ages gave way to something colder, cleaner, more bureaucratic, the duel, once a sacred clash blessed by priests and watched by entire villages, began to look like a messy leftover from a wilder time. It wasn't sudden. There was no royal decree that made everyone drop their swords and swear loyalty to logic. But slowly, as governments centralized, as courts matured, and as the divine stepped back to let laws speak, duels lost their place. They didn't vanish because people stopped being offended. They vanished because society began asking a new question. What if fairness isn't found in blood? For centuries, the idea of letting two men fight to reveal truth had seemed natural. After all, if God watched, if honor demanded it, then what higher authority could there be? But as Renaissance ideas spread, and with them a thirst for reason, science, and structure, that faith in fate started to look childish. The sword no longer felt sacred. It just felt noisy. Parliaments grew stronger. Courts began demanding evidence instead of oaths. The printing press taught people to question tradition. Cities became denser and public violence more disruptive. What once seemed glorious, two knights crashing in the mud while a priest chanted blessings, now seemed inconvenient, embarrassing, dangerous to order, and perhaps most damning of all, the duel stopped being useful to those in power. Kings no longer needed to quietly eliminate rivals in a field when they could do it through paperwork. Why allow a noble to settle a dispute with pistols when the crown could tax him instead? The duel, once a lever of control, became a risk. What if the wrong person won? What if a popular duelist embarrassed the court? What if the people stopped believing in the justice of outcomes? So laws tightened, clerics grew louder, judges imposed harsher penalties. In some countries, challenging someone to a duel became grounds for execution. In others, survivors were thrown in jail. And yet, duels kept happening. They just changed shape. The sacred arena became the private garden. The roar of villagers turned into the hush of elite witnesses. No more war cries or muddy wrestling. Now it was men in powdered wigs and silk waistcoats, facing each other at dawn, pistols drawn, boots polished, witnesses quiet. The Enlightenment didn't kill the duel, it rebranded it. By the 18th century, duels had become almost theatrical. Codes of conduct were published and memorized. Doctors stood by with clean hands. Seconds carried messages back and forth like diplomats. Insults were measured carefully, responses handwritten in flowing ink. The duel became less about truth and more about presentation. It was less, God will decide, and more, let us behave like gentlemen. The weapons changed too. Swords gave way to pistols, elegant, customized, and terrifyingly final. Unlike a sword, a pistol didn't give you time to gauge your opponent's skill. It didn't offer second chances. One shot, one heartbeat, that was all. And in many duels, it was over before anyone even bled. Some men deliberately missed, satisfied with the ritual. Others shot to maim, not kill. But the line between performance and punishment was razor thin. And still, people died. In 1804, Alexander Hamilton, founding father, economist, one of the brightest minds of early America, was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. Both men wore formal coats. Both followed the rules. Both knew the cost. But when the pistols cracked in the early morning light, Hamilton fell, not because of God, it's not because of honor, but because human pride, even dressed in silk, still bled when wounded. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. Poets, officers, politicians all found themselves towing the line between vanity and mortality. In France, duels over romantic slights reached such ridiculous proportions that newspapers printed weekly columns summarizing them. In Russia, young noblemen practiced fencing not for sport, but for inevitability. If you didn't duel, you weren't serious. And yet, even in its most fashionable form, the duel began to rot. Why? Because people started asking a second question. If we're so civilized, why are we still doing this? The courts were faster. The newspapers were louder. The public had more to say. A man could ruin you with a letter now, not just a blade. The duel, once a method of silencing insult, became a cause for it. Killing someone didn't make you righteous. It just made you dangerous, even cowardly. And as reputations began to hinge on restraint, not aggression, the duel began to feel like a relic. It lingered, of course. Traditions die slowly, but each duel felt more symbolic, more tragic. The last people to fight often did so for outdated reasons, clinging to a code no one truly believed in anymore. In 1967, a duel was fought in France between two politicians with épées. No one died, but the absurdity echoed. Why were middle-aged men poking each other over legislative insults? Because deep down, the duel had always been about control over your name, your narrative, your pride. And even in a world of ballots and lawsuits, some men couldn't let go of the idea that a single strike could fix everything. But the worlds had moved on, so the duel, once a thunderclap of justice in a muddy field, faded, not with a roar, but with a shrug, a silent acknowledgement that if you needed to kill to be heard, maybe you had nothing worth saying. At some point along the bloodied road from sacred combat to gentleman's ritual, the duel began to wobble, not from lack of courage, but from an overabundance of spectators, with expectations too high and attention spans too short. What once demanded reverence slowly collapsed into routine, and when ritual becomes routine, satire is never far behind. The duel, once whispered about in churches and chronicled in court records, began to look more like a staged performance, and sometimes, quite literally, a circus. The descent didn't happen in a single moment. It began with spectacle. As dueling faded from courtrooms and battlefields, it found a second life on the fringes, in public fields, at tavern doors, near traveling fairs. People were no longer just passive witnesses. They became a kind of jury, cheering or booing depending on who swung harder or screamed louder. Eventually, the audience didn't just observe the fight, they shaped it. They demanded drama. And when real fights didn't deliver enough tension or tragedy, people made their own. That's how a man once fought wearing a bucket as armor, or how a baker challenged the town crier to a duel with stale baguettes. These weren't crimes or scandals, they were entertainment, and the crowd, drunk on ale and irony, embraced the chaos. In 17th century Germany, a parody duel was staged in which one knight fought not another man, but a goose. The crowd roared. Bets were placed. The goose won, not because it attacked, but because it refused to run, staring down its human opponent with such menace that he surrendered out of embarrassment. A week later, someone arranged a rematch with a sheep. The sheep lost, but only barely. These weren't isolated cases. By the time the formal duel had left politics and entered legend, towns and cities were regularly hosting reenactments, dramatizations, and flat-out mockery. Actors dressed as flamboyant duelists with ridiculous wigs and foam swords. Children mimicked duels in back alleys with sticks. Pamphlets circulated with famous last words from fictional duels. I said ducks, not duels. My mustache accepts your challenge, or you scratched my loot, and now you must pay. But the line between parody and reality was thin, dangerously so. Some mock duels escalated. Alcohol, pride, and misunderstanding made a comedy act suddenly fatal. In England, two men staged a pretend duel during a wedding feast, using dulled rapiers, until one of them secretly swapped his blade and pierced the other's lung. The guests cheered, thinking it was part of the show, until he collapsed. That duel was supposed to be a joke. It ended in silence. So where was the line? When did a duel stop being a trial and become a circus? The answer lay not in the weapons, but in intention. When duels were sacred, they were deadly serious. They were about justice, vengeance, survival. But when they became entertainment, when winning didn't change anything, when the loser could shrug and go back to drinking, the duel lost its edge. It became theater, a reminder of something older, grander, more brutal, but also more meaningful. And yet, even as the real duel faded, its image exploded. The romantic version of the duel, two men under moonlight, pistols at 10 paces, hearts pounding, became a staple of novels, plays, and eventually film. Alexandre Dumas turned it into art. Hollywood turned it into gold. Westerns replaced rapiers with revolvers. Samurai films gave it discipline. Swashbucklers gave it flair. Audiences didn't want the mud and the blood. They wanted style. In stories, the duel was always about honor. The noble man protecting a woman's name. The last stand of a betrayed friend. The proud swordsman taking on a corrupt officer. It was clean, moral, poetic. It had rhythm, choreography, justice. Real duels, chaotic, one-sided, messy, weren't nearly so beautiful. But fiction needed rules. And the duel, once messy and unpredictable, became the perfect metaphor. It became shorthand for courage, for justice, for standing alone against overwhelming odds. Even superheroes in the modern age carry its echo, the showdown, the face-off, the one-on-one. But the legend edited out the truth. It forgot that most duels were about ego, that many fighters were forced into combat by peer pressure or public shame, that countless victims of dueling bled not for honor, but for absurdity. Forgotten are the peasants who fought over spoons, the lovers who died over a rumor, the nobles who used duels to eliminate rivals under the pretense of etiquette. Yes, there were moments of bravery. Yes, there were duels that upheld dignity. But they were the exception, not the rule. The truth is that the duel was never purely about honor. It was about fear. Fear of humiliation, fear of weakness, fear of being forgotten. And so, as the duel faded into myth, it became exactly what it never was, simple. In legend, it is the noble's last resort. In reality, it was often the coward's first weapon. And yet, the image persists, because deep down, we still believe in the idea that one decisive moment, one act of nerve and steel, can fix what words never could. That's the power of the duel, not in how it happened, but in how we remember it. For the medieval peasant, truth didn't live in books or courts. It bubbled in cauldrons, croaked from frogs, and whispered through dreams beneath the stars. Life was fragile, brutal, and short, and in such a world, logic had no teeth. What had teeth were wolves, plagues, and angry neighbors. So people turned to what they could grasp: roots with names, herbs with histories, and rituals handed down by wrinkled hands in candlelit huts. You didn't go to a doctor, you went to a woman with ash on her apron and birch bark in her hair. A stomach ache? Boil some wormwood. A fever? Tie a toad to your wrist and sleep facing east. Cursed? Rub your chest with dog's lard and chant the name of St. Hubert while looking into a bucket of still water. There were hundreds of such remedies, each more baffling than the last, but they weren't jokes. They were lifelines. When survival depended on the whims of weather and wounds could rot faster than crops could grow, even the most far-fetched cure was better than nothing. And people believed, not because they were ignorant, but because it was all they had. And the duel, brutal, illogical, theatrical, fit perfectly into this world. Because what was a duel, really, if not another folk ritual? A way to force the unseen forces to take a side? One man would call the other a liar or a thief. They'd fight. And when one fell, the people didn't see muscles or skill. They saw fate, divine intervention, a cosmic vote. It made sense, just like burying a rabbit's foot under your threshold to keep spirits out, just like drinking water collected from a church bell at dawn to heal your lungs, just like whispering to the stars the name of the person you feared or loved. But as centuries rolled forward, something began to shift. Books arrived. Not just any books. Books with drawings of the body. Books with Latin names for plants. Books that described illness not as punishment, but as imbalance. Universities spread. Libraries grew. And slowly, painfully, people began to ask, what if this isn't about spirits at all? The rise of medicine wasn't explosive. It was a slow erosion. Znakarki, the village wise women, didn't vanish overnight, but they began to be watched, questioned, feared, especially when their knowledge clashed with church authority or royal decree. Some were accused of witchcraft. Others faded into silence as midwives were replaced with men in robes and surgical tools. And duels? They began to look embarrassing, not just dangerous, but primitive, outdated, like bleeding someone to balance their humors, like placing a silver coin under a dying man's tongue to trap his soul. As science crept forward, these acts were pushed back into the shadows. Because with medicine came courts, with courts came law, with law came bureaucracy, and bureaucracy, for all its tedium, preferred signatures to swords. You didn't need to fight a man to prove your innocence. You needed evidence, witnesses, written statements, sworn oaths on paper, not in blood. But the transition wasn't clean. Superstition doesn't vanish just because someone invents a microscope. People still clung to rituals. Doctors were distrusted, especially when they failed, which they often did. And sometimes, when all else failed, people still believed a duel could reveal what ink could not. There's something almost tragic in that, because by the time the duel finally died and the last Znacharka closed her shutters for good, the world had already changed beyond recognition. Steam engines shrieked across the land, telegraph wires hummed in the wind, cities rose where forests once stood. But in the quiet corners of villages, beneath low beams and mossy roofs, someone still tied red thread around a child's wrist to ward off fever. Someone still spat 3 times to break a curse. Someone still whispered, "He died in a duel, you know." Took a blade through the ribs, but never cried. And maybe that's the final truth about this strange, bruised era. The duel and the potion, the blade and the frog, they weren't just about truth or healing. They were about control. In a world that made no sense, they gave people the illusion that they could act, that they could do something, swing a sword, boil a root, decide. And when that vanished, when science took over with all its sterile tools and careful language, something was gained, but something was lost too. Because belief, no matter how foolish, is still a form of hope. And for centuries, hope was carried in fists, in herbs, in steel, and sometimes in a scream beneath the stars. There's a shadow that lingers over the history of the duel, a figure just beyond the blade, not clad in steel but in black linen and waxed leather, eyes hidden behind glass, breath rasping through a beaked mask. The plague doctor, the walking contradiction, not a warrior, not quite a healer, but something colder. The duel ended when he arrived, not with a flourish of swords, but with silence, gloves, and the smell of vinegar. If the duelist fought to prove truth through pain, the plague doctor wandered through a world where pain no longer had answers. He wore his costume not for theater, but for survival. The long coat, the stick to keep the infected at distance, the mask filled with herbs. It all came from desperation, not drama. But the irony was cruel. His uniform became one of the most theatrical images in all of European memory. And in it, people saw not science, but judgment. Just like the duel, the plague doctor arrived in moments of chaos, when the world cracked open and people wanted someone to do something, to cure, to kill, to decide. And when there were no more judges, no more gods, no more courts or champions, the plague doctor became the last man standing between life and decay. He didn't fight with a sword, but his arrival was just as final. He wasn't hope. He was confirmation that it was already too late. And maybe that's why the image still haunts us. Not because of death, but because of the helplessness it represents. Because we look at that mask and we see the moment history stopped pretending it could be fair. The moment honor no longer mattered. When the sword was put away, not out of choice, but because it was useless. And yet, even as logic, science, and medicine reshaped the world, the duel refused to vanish completely. It slipped into our stories, our games, our metaphors. Because something about it still pulls at us, not the violence, but the clarity. In a world of complex systems and endless ambiguity, the duel offered a brutal, simple answer. One truth, one fight, one outcome. We know it doesn't work that way. We know real justice is slow, flawed, layered with context. We know that evidence, not emotion, should guide decisions. That pain doesn't prove righteousness. That logic, though imperfect, is the closest thing we have to fairness. And yet, part of us still wonders, what if one strike could settle it all? What if a single blow, perfectly timed, could silence every doubt? This is the ghost the duel left behind, not the method, but the idea. That truth is something you can fight for, bleed for, maybe even die for. That truth is more than opinion, that it's worth something, that it can be lost, and maybe, if you're brave enough, reclaimed. But in the modern world, where battles are fought with algorithms and reputations are destroyed by posts, the duel seems almost gentle, even noble. It didn't require millions of eyes, just two. It didn't humiliate in secret. It risked everything in front of everyone. And when it ended, whether with a handshake or a fall, the story was finished. Today, stories never finish. Truth isn't decided in fields or gardens, but in comment sections and boardrooms, courtrooms, and screens. The duel has no place there. It's been replaced by policy, data, sarcasm, and maybe that's progress. But maybe, too, that's why we still dream of it. Because buried beneath the mud and myth, the duel asked a question we haven't answered. Can truth exist without pain? Can justice live without risk? And if not, if some truths are so vital, so visceral, that they must be fought for, then maybe we haven't outgrown the duel at all. We've just disguised it, with suits instead of swords, with signatures instead of scars, with silence instead of steel. But the spirit remains, waiting, watching us, and sometimes whispering that final dangerous promise. There are still truths worth bleeding for. Somewhere in a modern courtroom, clean and white and quiet, a man in a sweater stands before a judge and makes a request that sounds like a punchline. Trial by combat. No, he's not joking. No, he's not quoting a movie. He's dead serious. He cites ancient law. He invokes forgotten clauses. He asks to settle a legal dispute not through motions or appeals, but with blades. And for a brief, uncomfortable moment, no one can immediately tell him he's wrong. Because buried deep within the foundations of certain Western legal systems are fossilized fragments of an older world, clauses left untouched, unenforced, presumed extinct, yet never formally erased. A glitch in the matrix of law, a whisper from the age of steel. In 2002, a British man fighting a speeding ticket demanded a duel. He offered to fight the authorities to the death or until one yields, claiming it was his right under Saxon tradition. The case was thrown out, but not without hesitation. Technically, the law hadn't explicitly banned it. In 2013, an American from Kansas filed a motion asking for a sword fight against his ex-wife's lawyer. He even specified the type of katana he'd prefer. The judge called the request unorthodox, but also admitted there's no clear law against it. No duel occurred, but the story made headlines, not just because of its absurdity, but because it exposed a deeper question. What do we actually want when we ask for justice? Courtrooms promise reason, but they often deliver frustration, rules upon rules, delays, hidden costs, cold logic. For those who feel betrayed by the system, cheated, unheard, dragged through endless paperwork, the idea of a duel, ridiculous as it sounds, holds an ancient allure, clarity, no appeals, no ambiguity, one fight, one answer. It's not about violence, it's about control. And in an age when people feel more powerless than ever, lost in bureaucracy, buried under algorithms, flattened by institutions, that idea still bites. That maybe, just maybe, you could reclaim your voice, your dignity, your truth, if only someone would hand you a sword. Of course, we don't live in that world, and we shouldn't. A society that replaces judges with duels is one that's given up on justice. It rewards strength over sense. It punishes the weak. It feeds ego. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It's emotionally satisfying. The duel is messy, flawed, archaic, but it feels right in a way the cold click of a gavel never does. And that's why it refuses to die. It survives not in law, but in legend. Because what began as a blood-soaked ritual eventually became something more powerful than any blade, a symbol. A duel is a test of truth, of will, of identity. In stories, we duel for love, for justice, for honor. In music, the guitar solo becomes a duel of notes. In politics, debates are framed as verbal duels. In games, two players face off, not for gold, but for glory. Even children feel it. The playground stare down, the whispered prove it. The idea that some truths can't be told, they have to be shown. Duels gave us more than scars and corpses. They gave us archetypes, the underdog, the proud warrior, the silent hero. They shaped how we write conflict, how we stage climax, how we think about fairness. The final confrontation, the last words, the single shot, it's all a duel in disguise. And maybe that's the real legacy, because the duel, for all its madness, was never just a fight. It was a mirror. It reflected the fears and values of its age. In the medieval world, it reflected a belief in divine justice. In the Renaissance, it echoed vanity and pride. In the Enlightenment, it became theater. In the modern world, it's nostalgia, a yearning for simplicity in a maze of noise. We know better now. We know pain doesn't prove truth. But deep down, we still feel the pull, not toward violence, but toward resolution. Toward a moment where the world pauses and someone says, "This ends here." That's why we keep telling the story. Why we keep drawing the swords in ink and pixels. Why even in a courtroom filled with statutes and silence, someone might still whisper, "Trial by combat?" Not because it's smart, but because it's human.